All right.
Here we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Harbor Time Strategy Talks. I'm your host, Colin Harbor, and we've officially turned the corner. It's 2021. I know last year was tough for a lot of people, and it was really, really tough for some. But I, for one, am glad that we're in 2021, and I'm glad to look towards the future and what the future holds. I'm excited about this year. I don't know what's going to happen. I know right now I'm doing something completely different than I was doing 9 months ago. So who knows? That might be the same this year, but it was an interesting 2020. I really hope that everyone enjoys this week's episode. I know I've enjoyed receiving feedback from everyone. I love the input. I appreciate the text. It really means a lot to know that people are listening. But I also want to encourage you to like the podcast, to share the podcast if you can. If you're watching it on YouTube, I would encourage you to subscribe and add comments. That's very helpful and very useful. So please share the podcast and please continue to listen. Like I said, I hope we continue to bring value to you and provide meaningful content. One of the interesting things that we have all watched over the last year or the last 9 months, if you want to call it, is how people simply stopped going places. I've mentioned on a previous podcast at the end of February, I was in Orlando at a conference, the Mortgage Bankers Association industry conference with thousands of people without face masks, in bars, in restaurants, in breakout sessions, working for a different company. And then all of a sudden it all stopped. And what I've been thinking a lot about the last week or so in preparation for this episode is think about the retail industry. Think about the restaurant industry. I'm not talking about the political side. I'm done with politics personally, and I don't want to politicize things. But think about the fact that, at the end of February, at the beginning of March, I would just go to any restaurant. I'd go to any store. I wouldn't think twice about it. Now, if my children want to go somewhere, if I need something, I have to think about it. Can I order it online? Is it easier to have it delivered? Do I have a face mask in my car? Do I really want to risk getting COVID to go get toothpaste or whatever the case may be? So, there's a lot of things that have happened. I, for one, again, used to meet with clients multiple times per week for lunch, for dinner, for happy hour. That really slowed. Well, it came to a complete halt for a while, picked up for a while, and now it's back to normal. So, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Shelia Butler. Sheila and I have known each other for several years. It's kind of interesting to think about, Sheila, that essentially we've known each other for 20 years, and we were classmates in Baylor University's executive MBA program in the early 2000s. And that's really difficult for me to say, but that was a long time ago. And so it's weird when you say the early 2000s, because again, we're in 2021, but Sheila is presently the chief operating officer for The Arrangement, which is a furniture store based in Houston and Dallas. And I was looking at their website. They do rustic, modern, Western. Now, I'm not going to butcher any of it, but that's what they do. So I've been in a lot of houses that have that look, and I really like it. But Sheila also has built and sold 2 different companies in the past. She's been a consultant, and so she's got consulting experience. She even had a podcast several years ago, everybody. So not in 2020 when the rest of us started podcasts, but as she recently reminded me, she was podcasting before podcasting was cool. I think she used to have a soundboard. She used to have a big setup. So it was a lot different than now where we just plug a microphone in and go. So Sheila, thank you for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who is Shelia Butler and what are you up to these days?
Sure. Colin, thanks for having me on. It's a privilege, and it is hard to believe when you said we've known each other for 20 years, because look how good we still look. That's what I'm thinking. I mean,
I was just thinking the same thing, Sheila. Thanks.
No, thanks again. I am, I kind of fell into this industry, the furniture wholesale and decor industry many years ago, actually in business school. I was in the medical field before, actually when I started in business school and met Colin, I was in the medical field. And during school, we had these study groups. Colin and I actually, we were in some groups together. And there was another person in one of those groups by the name of Randall, and he had an idea to start a furniture company. And somehow he and I hooked up basically from a business perspective, I'm saying, in business school. And we started a company, a wholesale company called Aiden Gray Home. And that company is still in existence. I sold my part in that business in about 2010. We started about 2004. And then I did consulting in this industry for about 7 years. And the consulting led me into co-founding another wholesale furniture business, which I sold a couple of years ago to a large wholesale company by the name of Uttermost. So I, again, fell into this industry by accident, and I am privileged to still be in this industry. It's fun. It's exciting. I see things a little bit differently than most people in this industry because I didn't come from this industry. And I think that's probably been some of my success has helped me along the way. So that's how I ended up here. And actually consulting is how I ended up here at the arrangement. I consulted with them for several years, and they wanted to make some pretty significant changes. And I ended up coming on board here full time as their COO when I sold my last business. So that's how I ended up here.
All right. Well, great.
And for many years.
And let me make that's a great point. That last thing you just said. So the businesses the business you had with Randall and Hanley Drive, your other business, those were wholesalers. So.
Correct. Yeah. So we were wholesale furniture businesses. So we actually designed and then had the product manufactured, brought that product in mainly from overseas, and then distributed that to retailers and interior designers throughout the US and beyond.
Okay. But what you're doing now is retail. The arrangement is retail.
Yeah. So it's a totally different thing. I'd never spent any time in retail other than some consulting. And so it's different. So now I'm on the other side of that. So I deal with the retail side of it, but it's helpful because I also have such a firm foundation in the wholesale side of it. It's been beneficial for us from a business perspective.
Yeah, well, good. All right. Well, that's a great introduction. So then let's start with the podcast, your previous podcast. When you mentioned that a couple of weeks ago when we were talking, I had forgotten that, but I think as I've gone through my memory banks, I remember you having a podcast, and I remember thinking, why does she have a podcast?
What the heck is she doing?
What is a podcast, and why does she have a podcast? But what inspired you to start your podcast, and what was the focus of the podcast?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I really did start podcasting about 9, maybe 10 years ago. So that was, although there were podcasts during that time, people were doing podcasting, but video podcasting was brand new. And I actually started a video podcast as well, and then distributed that out to just regular audio podcasts. But so at that time I was really trying to determine what I wanted to do. I had sold Aiden Gray. I had a non-compete for a few years, so I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was trying to find myself. So I was reading a lot, like Tim Ferriss. The 4-Hour Work Week was popular back then. Gary Vaynerchuk was very popular back then. Sure. So I started listening to podcasts, and I got into it, and I started following a guy by the name of Cliff Ravenscraft, and he does a lot of tutorials and teaching on podcasting. And I kind of got into that group, and I went to some podcast conventions. And so I did it for marketing because I didn't really understand marketing. I didn't understand the social media marketing. I didn't understand content marketing. So I was learning all about it. And I thought that would be a great way to advertise my services and start to develop podcasting and start to develop myself within the industry, which was fantastic. I did it. My very first podcast was called Successful Women Talk. So it was mainly just focused on interviewing and talking to business women. And I did that probably about 90, 95 episodes maybe of that.
Oh, okay.
And then I got busy with work again because my non-compete was over, and I ended up going back into some heavy consulting, did a lot of traveling. I had clients up in New York City. I was in New York City quite a bit. And so I stopped the podcasting, and I missed it. And then I ended up deciding that I was going to start another one. So 2007, 2008, maybe. maybe a little longer than that, I started another podcast specific to the wholesale furniture industry
Okay.
called To the Trade Radio. I did like about 35 episodes of that. The problem with it was that it was premature for that industry. So the wholesale and furniture industry is really kind of a little behind as far as technology, et cetera, is concerned. No one in the industry even probably knew what a podcast was. So it's really hard to get any traction. Now there are multiple podcasts within the industry, so it's kind of interesting. So I was almost like ahead of my time. I would like now, I think, just because it'd be fun and I understand it, and I'd use it a little bit differently, but I enjoyed it. I have never met a stranger, so I have a knack for talking and being able to interview people, and it served me well. So I used it really for learning how to market and get out there.
So there's a couple of things to take from that. One is you mentioned Gary Vaynerchuk or Gary V. I actually started this podcast because of Gary V. Gary Vaynerchuk. When back in March and April, when all the stuff was breaking and I had lost my job and I was trying to figure out, okay, now what do I do with the rest of my life? I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and Gary V was one of them. And he had people calling in to talk to him, and the advice he was giving more and more, whether it was through TikTok or LinkedIn or Instagram or podcast or whatever, is you have some sort of business. If you want to start a business, if you want to be a consultant, if you want to do, start a podcast. Start putting your information out there. Put your content out there. Let people know who you are and what you do, or do it on TikTok, or fill in the blank. So really, Gary Vaynerchuk is the reason, if I had to say, probably the number one reason that I started this. And then the second thing I would say is maybe the time is right for a third podcast.
Maybe so. Like you said, it's so much easier. I remember when I first started, I had a complete setup. So I had a mixer, and it was a production. And even editing back then was so much more challenging. So today I think it's easier. I did use Skype back then, but Zoom is even easier. There were just so many things that make it much easier than it was back then. You couldn't even go somewhere and buy a microphone. Like, you had to order all of that. Like, you can go now to Best Buy and get a microphone pretty easily.
Where I bought this one, sure.
So, but that was challenging back then. So it was fun though. I learned a lot. And, like you said, though, I think the most important thing about podcasting, excuse me, I kind of see it as, there are many ways that you have to get yourself out there, especially if you want to be considered a thought leader or seen as a thought leader. Mm-hmm. And that's one of many ways. And, with a podcast, especially if you do video, you can share that in many different ways. You could have it transcribed, and you could have the transcript of that. You could do the audio of it. So you could have it on Apple and Podbean and all those types of things. You can have it on YouTube because you have it on the video. So sure. It's another way to really generate some content as a thought leader. And I think I think it helps you also learn a little bit more about who you are, and like not be afraid to fail. Like, I almost didn't start podcasting because I'm such a hick. So I have such a Southern accent, but I have found in every was like, it puts people at ease. Don't let that ever stop you.
Yeah. So that's funny. One of my biggest drawbacks when I started doing video content back in March and April was my accent. I thought, oh my gosh, I always knew I had the accent, but now I hear it. But anyway,
see it.
Yeah. So, and it's funny too about thought leader. I at my a company I was at a few years ago, I told the CEO that I really kind of had started to establish myself as a thought leader. So as a joke, him and the marketing lady that we had made a business card for me that said Colin Harbor, thought leader. And
I like that. But
thought leader, yeah.
Yeah, another thing, Colin, is it also helped me start speaking to people more, and it helped lead me also to other consulting gigs. Sure. And also put me out there on a speaking circuit. So I still do quite a bit of speaking, mainly in our industry and to small businesses, because of my early days in podcasting.
Sure. Well, that's good. That is fun. I think all of those reasons you did the podcast and all the results that you hoped to achieve and did achieve are the same goals that I have with Harbor Time Strategy Talks. It's Miller time, right? It's Harbor time.
Right. I like it.
So let's talk about how you start up a company and sell it in 3 years. Obviously you had worked with, or you did Aiden Gray with Randall, and we talked about that, but I really want to just focus on Hanley Drive. What kind
Sure.
of work did you put into that company to make it desirable for acquisition after only 3 years? I mean, a lot of people would love to do that after a couple of years, right? So what are
Yeah.
how did you get that going? And let's talk
Well,
about that.
yeah, that's a good question because that's kind of unheard of that quickly, especially kind of in this industry. But what happened was I was doing some consulting and I had a friend that I had done some consulting with. And he calls me one day and says, "Hey, I have this guy. He's a product designer and he's thinking about starting his own company. Would you just have coffee with him and just give him some pointers on maybe what he should think about when he's starting a business?" So we did, and we met. And then a few days later, he calls me and asks me if I'd like to partner in this business because he's like, "I'm a product designer. I'm not a business. I don't understand the business side of it." I mean, he does. He's super, super smart. Same as Rick Janicek, super smart. But he didn't have the everyday knowledge of building a wholesale company from the ground up and all those things that went with it. He was a fantastic, marvelous, and still is product designer, but wanted to focus on that. So I was like, "Yeah, no, I've done the partnership thing before. I'm really enjoying consulting. I don't think that I want to do that at this time." And then that went a couple more weeks, he calls me again, and we ended up starting talking, and we decided to actually launch and start Hanley Drive. So that's how we ended up deciding on the second company. And really, the company was built around Rick's design. So Rick is a fantastic product designer, and he knew what he wanted. And I just had to help figure out a way to structure a business around that, get the business out there and known, and then grow the business. And we had another business partner. His name was Don. He had many years in retail experience with Pier 1. So we had a really interesting combination. So we almost were ahead of the game with that as well. So we knew immediately Rick wanted to design a line that would be focused on interior designers. Not that we didn't want to focus on retailers, because that's a huge part of the business, but the furniture and decor industry is shifting. And interior designers a long time ago weren't even allowed in wholesale showrooms. So they were kind of shunned, but they are now the leading buyers in our business. So Rick knew that, and we wanted to design our business around that, and we did. And what that did for us, it automatically put us at a higher end line. It was a higher end price point. It looked more established and high end, and so we got attention pretty fast. And we put a lot of money into the company. The problem that we had was today starting a business was much different than it was when we started Aiden Gray. It was a little bit easier then, I think, than it is today. So we were putting a ton of cash into it, and we had great sales from the very beginning. But to get to the point that we wanted to be, we knew we were going to have to invest more in the company. And we were at that whole, like, what do we want to do? Do we go big or go home, or, and we were successful. And we had a couple of companies that came to us that were interested in acquiring us because they wanted that look and feel into their company. So to get what Rick had physically designed was really hard to do, and it would take many, many, many years. So the acquisition of Hanley Drive was very favorable to some really large companies. And so at that point, we just decided that it was the right thing to do. It was a good offer. It was good timing. Really, probably what they were buying more than anything was Rick and Rick's design and the look of Hanley Drive. But we had also built up a very nice clientele, especially of interior designers. The companies that were looking at us, they were okay with interior designers, but they didn't have a good interior design business. So because of the way we structure ourselves from the beginning, made us very favorable for an acquisition early on, and it happened pretty quickly. Big company, so we were really lucky, and that company's now been acquired and kind of enveloped right into Uttermost, and it's done really well and still continuing on with some of the things that we produced in the past and new designs from that product designer, etc. So yeah.
Luck counts. I can tell you that much. You mentioned lucky. Luck counts, but obviously there was a lot of hard work, a lot of thought put into that. And a lot of it is timing in business, right? So
it is.
And then making the decisions. So speaking of decisions then and strategic advice, Do you have maybe any nuggets? I mean, we're getting to the age where we can pass along nuggets, right, Sheila? But do you have any strategic advice to pass along to someone who might be thinking, hey, I want to start my own company today in 2021? Where should they really focus to get the business? Maybe not a furniture business, wholesale,
Sure.
retail, but just in general, what should be the focus to get a business going?
So I think that we could look at it from a business perspective, and there are lots of books out there about how you can grow your business and start a business and funding for a business. And I think for me, I kind of look at it a little bit differently, a little bit more intentional and a little bit more wholehearted. And what I would say to someone wanting to start a business is, if you have an idea, that's fantastic. I think that you have to know, I would say there are three big things that I think now I would probably do differently. And if I were starting another business, I would think this way again. And I would want to really be clear on my values, my governing values. So there was a guy named Hiram W. Smith. He was the co-founder. He was Franklin Covey.
Yeah.
And that invented Franklin Quest way back in the day, Palm Pilot, etc. He has this many books, but one of the things that he talks about are your governing values. So what you really got to know who you are and what you stand for in life. And he goes through this lesson basically of saying, pick out what your top 5 governing values are, and that will help you make any decision in life. And once you really know what those are, you can make a decision. So let's say that family is your number 1 governing value, and maybe financial freedom is your second. You would know quickly that if a job or starting a company is going to take you away from your family every single day, maybe that's not the right thing.
Sure.
Or maybe it is, but you've got to really know who you are and what you want. So I think that's most important, because that will help drive how you structure your business, the time you put into it, your goals for that. So I think it's super important. My second thing that I think most people get confused on in business today and in starting a business is clarity. I think you really have to be very clear on what your goals are, what your habits are, your communication, clarity in every aspect of your life, from your values to everything that you do from starting a business. I think you have to be super, super clear. And then the third thing is, I think that a lot of people think you have to do a million things. You have to be on all of the social media platforms. You have to understand SEO. You have to have a website. All of those things are important. But I think it's super, super, super important to remember that there are only 3 ways to grow a business. Increase your number of clients, increase the average value transaction of a client, increase the number of transactions per year. Decide what of all of those things you have to do to make that happen, and focus on a few. I think so many people try and focus on so many that they are busy instead of productive. And I think that's really hard to stay true to yourself, who you want to be, how you want to grow your business, if you don't keep those 3 things in mind and figure out what you can do and do well. And don't be afraid to think that you don't need to be on all the different platforms. You don't need to understand everything. Hire or bring people on, bring on a mentor and get a mentor. Listen to a podcast, read a book. There are so many things that you can do to help you without thinking that you have to know. And then the number 1 thing I think is, don't be afraid to fail.
Yeah. I think that last one is key. And even going back to what we talked about with our podcast and our Southern drawl and our accent, there's so many things you could put in your mind to be concerned with. What will others think of me if I do this and it doesn't make sense? What will, this person, and again, to go back to Gary V would say, who cares? I mean, he had
Exactly.
he had stronger language.
It's a little stronger.
Yeah.
Colin, you know what's funny is, I remember like when I sold Aiden Gray, and I had that little period that I had a non-compete. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Did I want to go back into healthcare? Did I want to stay in this industry? So I had hired a coach. And so I had all of these people calling me. So many people, I had a company call me that was in our industry that said, I know you're not, I don't know how they knew, but I know your non-compete is over in a few months. Mm-hmm. So it's over. Will you come do for us what you did for Aiden Gray? And then I had another person that called and said the same thing. And so my life coach, because I was like, I don't know what I want to do. My life coach is like, you're an idiot, because listen, you have people calling you. You must do something right in that arena, because people are asking you for advice and help and coaching and mentoring. And And so I think it hit me that, maybe I don't know everything, but I do know a lot in this industry and I do have some experience, and I wasn't afraid to fail. And that has it's been great for me, because in this industry, I've become a leader in this industry and a thought leader. And I'm asked to speak at different conferences and leadership conferences. It's amazing. So, but I would not have done that had I not been afraid to fail and try something different.
Yeah, well, that's great. That is awesome and great advice. And speaking of other strategic advice, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, of course, because I always look at LinkedIn, and I noticed that you obviously post and content a lot of articles and put information out there. But one of the items you have listed is that you focus on strategic planning and leadership. So how does Sheila Butler do strategic planning and leadership best, or how do you focus on it?
So I think for me, when I work with people, my experience has been most small business owners had an idea and it was a good idea and they started a business, but they don't know what they don't know, right? And that's okay. And once they're okay with admitting that they don't know what they don't know and are willing to learn from others, it can make a big impact in their business. So I think for me, when I was consulting, I had sort of a course that I would put my clients through. And some of it started with very simple things that we already talked about, like knowing your governing values, really sitting down, spending a weekend, learning who you are and what you want, because that defines everything that you have to do on your daily choices. I don't think that I don't manage time, I manage choices. And so I think a lot of that is when you're teaching someone or helping someone, it's really understanding and being clear about what it is that you want and how you're going to get there. So I sometimes say the who, the how, and the what. So who am I going to try and influence, or what I'm going to do? How are we going to do that? And there's a lot of ways to do that. And then, the what am I going to do daily to make those things happen? So for instance, if I wanted to lose 15 pounds, how am I going to do that? Maybe I'm going to change my diet. Maybe I'm going to have a coach, but what am I going to do daily? So what are your daily choices? And that comes down to goal setting. And that comes down to knowing why you have those goals. And I just think that it's from a larger approach of not so much the business side of it, which we normally get to, we always get to. But I think that there's some clarity and work you have to do first. And that's, I think, become intentional with your daily life, become intentional with your leadership, become intentional with your business goals. And so I think defining those things and really getting to understand someone and them understanding who they are is a really good place when I start with strategy. And then we get into the normal business things of process and planning and value stream mapping and all of those types of things. But really, you got to know, I think, first of what drives you and how you're going to get there.
Sure.
That will keep you on the path every day, because it gets crazy when you're starting a business. And as you know, sometimes you're just playing whack-a-mole trying to keep up. And it helps if you've planned around those things and you know where you want to be and you stay focused and not be afraid to pivot. Just because you've had an idea doesn't mean you have to stick with that one thing. Learn to pivot and to pivot quickly, and don't be embarrassed by that.
So pivoting quickly is another one, right? And I think a lot of people probably learned that this year, and a lot of people maybe still are afraid to do that. And the example, I've got an example. I thought I was going to be a big quote guy on social media. So I was going to post a business quote every day from a business leader. And I've got software that I use that automatically posts it. So I can do 10 posts all at once and not have to worry about it for 2 weeks. After 2 or 3 weeks, I thought, man, those were great quotes. They meant a lot to me. They probably meant a lot to the people who read them, but I don't want to do that anymore. But then I started wondering, well, then I'm kind of waffling on what I was going to do. And I heard maybe it was another podcast, I don't know who said, it's okay to pivot. Who cares?
Pivot, yeah.
If you try something for a month and you don't want to do it anymore, just don't do it. 6 months from now, you may want to do it again. You can come back and do that.
Right.
I think getting out of that mindset. Yeah.
You've learned different skill sets. So it's not like you didn't learn something from that. So learn from that. And then grow from that. I think that's just super important. It's the same thing like, People think, like, especially in our industry, that social media is just an advertising tool. And it's getting better in our industry, but for a while it was horrible. So, social media is named social because it should be social. So if you're just, I don't know, like, I know you said you like Gary Vee. So Gary Vee has a book called Jab, 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 Right Hook.
Okay.
Several years old, but the concept of it is the same. Like, you don't just put your content out there, you jab with other people's content and you share other stuff, and then you throw out something about yourself. So it's not all about you, because no one really cares about you. They really care about themselves. So
Right.
how can you help them be better? And some of that's learning from that, like you did, and pivoting.
Yeah, that's good. I have not read that book. But speaking of books, you teed it up because I know you saw the agenda or the outline. And my next question is, have you read any good books lately? And if so, what sticks out the most and why?
Yeah, so I love to read, and I love to listen to audiobooks on my commuting quite a bit. So I had to really think about this because there are a lot of books I really like. But the book that I probably, and I'm going to kind of go back to 2019, that I used the most and I talked about the most, and when I was doing conferences, virtual now, we talk about the most. It's a book called Clarity First by a lady by the name of Karen Martin. Now it's a little bit business nerdy, but it really goes back to, in 2020, my word for the year was clarity. And with my team, we talked about that, and we got real clear on our goals, and we really drilled down on what that meant on our communicating. A lot of time in companies is spent having to clarify what you said. So if you're really intentional and clear on the front end, you don't have to do all the rework. So, but that's a good book. So that Clarity First is probably the book that I would say is a super good read about how to get really clear so that your organization can be better and more profitable, etc.
And if you want to read a business nerdy book, that's a good one to go to.
Right? Yeah, and it's not terrible. She's got some others that are pretty deep on the nerdy side, but because she's super smart. Nerdy side. Clarity First is a really good book.
Yes. So who is your favorite business leader and why?
Well, this was a hard one as well, because I follow a lot of different people. Like, I like that we threw out Gary Vee. I don't follow him as much as I used to, but I think if I had to pick someone that I would consider kind of a role model, that if I see something that she's published, I will read, it's probably like Sarah Berkeley, from the CEO of Spanx. And I like her because she's pretty down to earth. She bootstrapped her company from the very beginning. Everyone told her, no, 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 no. And, her father every day told her, you don't be afraid to fail. And if she didn't, I think I read something one time that said that every day her father would ask she and her siblings, what did you fail at today? And if they didn't have anything, he'd just be disappointed in them. Mm-hmm. So I like that about her. And she's just super successful and down to earth, and as a mom, and runs a business, and as a philanthropist. So yeah. I like those aspects of who she is.
I followed her some on LinkedIn and seen she posts some of the old pictures of her garage was essentially the warehouse, just all that kind of stuff. And that's what a lot of people forget about, going back to some of what we talked about earlier. And I forget about it too, is if you're starting a business, it's not Amazon.com today, right? It's not Microsoft. No. It's not these things. You have to build it.
That's a great point. When I think about it, think about starting Hanley Drive is, yes, we knew a lot because Rick and I both, and Don had been in the industry for many years, but it didn't change the fact that we were still bootstrapped in the beginning. So, Rick was off traveling all over the world designing product, and I was back here getting our warehouse set up, unloading containers. I can drive a forklift. So all of those things, I know how to properly package lamps that will make it through the UPS system. And those are the things that will help you be successful in business. Knowing how to cube out a pallet. That is not sexy, but that's business. That's
it's got to be done sometimes, right? Well, it's got to be done all the time. Sometimes it's got to be done by the owner. Right?
Exactly.
Well, that is good. Sheila, I enjoyed our conversation a couple of weeks ago. I'm glad you guys got to go on a vacation and have a nice little break. And I'm glad you're back and were able to join us today. I do think your experience, particularly in bootstrapping, right? And getting things done and starting companies. And then I love the fact that you've done some speaking and the consulting business. I mean, that's a lot of people's dreams, but it's not something that happens overnight, right? I mean, you got to work.
No, it's really not.
You got to be intentional about it. You've got to do all these things. But yeah, so I appreciate you being on the show, and look forward to staying in touch in years to come. But did you have anything you wanted to add at the last minute?
No, other than, thanks again. It's always a pleasure. And I know you've had a lot of success as well. I'm glad that you're doing the podcast, and I encourage other people to not be afraid of failing and getting out there and doing something different. And you can post my email address if you want I am happy to, I do a lot of business mentoring.
That's a great question. If somebody wanted to get in touch, so I normally ask this question. I don't know why I left it off. If somebody wants to get in touch with Sheila Butler, how do they do that?
So the best way to reach me is probably via email or LinkedIn. And email is sbutler@sheilabutler.com. Now spell my name weird, SHELIA, butler.com. But yeah, happy to answer any questions or anything we've talked about today. I didn't really ever have a business mentor. I had a guy when I first started that gave me an opportunity that he probably shouldn't have. And that helped me get to where I am today. So he must have seen something in me that I didn't see in myself. But I like to give back and be a mentor. And that's why I do a lot of speaking, and I do some mentoring with women in business because I didn't always have that. And I think it's important because you have to learn. We all start somewhere. So happy to answer any questions or whatever.
Well, I would encourage anybody to reach out to you. They could listen to this short 20 to 30 minutes and realize the great experience and the great knowledge that you have. We sat by each other essentially. I guess I sat behind you for 2 years, and that was fun. Got to know you back then. Like you said, we were in study groups together. We traveled the world together, I guess technically as part of our executive MBA program. But it's been really fun watching you through the years, and it's always fun to talk and be back in touch. So thanks a lot for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening. Like I said, please subscribe. Feel free to share the information with others, add comments. I always welcome feedback. You could go to colinharbor.com and send me messages through that. So thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
again.